When Barron Trump, seeking a quiet weekend getaway in Wyoming, was rejected from the luxurious Grand Crest Hotel over his MAGA hat, he never expected the ensuing media firestorm. But amidst the national debate, it was Barron's unexpected and powerful response that ultimately silenced the chaos and revealed a profound truth about empathy in a divided world. The crisp mountain air of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, usually offered a serene escape, but for Barron Trump, it had become the epicenter of a national controversy. He had envisioned a quiet weekend, a brief respite from the relentless scrutiny, the suffocating weight of being a Trump that accompanied his every move. The Grand Crest Hotel, renowned for its breathtaking views and discreet clientele, seemed like the perfect sanctuary. As his car, driven by Agent Miller, a man whose stoicism was as much a part of his uniform as his dark suit, rolled up the cobblestone driveway, Barron took a deep breath. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile possibility that he might just blend in, be another anonymous young man enjoying a weekend away. Wearing a plain hoodie pulled low over his favorite red MAGA hat, he stepped into the gleaming marble lobby. The atmosphere was as expected, quiet, refined, understated. A few guests glanced his way, but no one stared. To them, he was just another customer, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to erupt. Or so he thought. Approaching the front desk, Barron adjusted his hat, a familiar, almost unconscious gesture, and placed his ID and credit card on the polished counter. The receptionist, Mr. Harrison, a man in his early 30s with an impeccably polished demeanor, greeted him warmly at first. But his expression shifted, hardening almost imperceptibly the moment his eyes landed on the crimson hat. A subtle change, but one that Barron, accustomed to being scrutinized, instantly registered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Trump," Mr. Harrison said, his tone cautious, laced with a forced politeness that felt more like a thinly veiled reprimand. "Our management has a strict policy against overtly political attire. I'm afraid we cannot check you in unless you remove your cap." Barron froze, caught completely off guard. He'd stayed at countless hotels, worn this very hat in more contentious places, and had never faced anything like this. He tilted his head, a question mark etched on his young face, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, each word carefully enunciated. "Are you saying I can't stay here because of my hat?" Mr. Harrison glanced around nervously, as if looking for backup in the silent, opulent lobby. "It's not personal, Mr. Trump. It's just a policy we have in place to maintain a neutral environment for all our guests." The words were hollow, devoid of genuine conviction. Barron's face remained impassive, a mask he'd perfected over years in the public eye. But inside, a storm was brewing, a tempest of frustration, anger, and a deep-seated weariness. "I've already booked a suite," he replied evenly, his voice like tempered steel. "You've taken my money. Now you're telling me my hat is a problem?" Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, his polished facade beginning to crack. Guests nearby had started to notice the exchange, their hushed whispers like a rising tide. Barron could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment, the assumptions, but he refused to back down. He was tired of being a symbol, a pawn in a game he never asked to play. "It's not about the money," Mr. Harrison insisted, his voice losing its earlier confidence. "We'll issue a full refund if needed, but the policy stands." For a fleeting moment, Barron considered taking off the hat, if only to avoid the hassle, the unwanted attention. But something about the situation struck a nerve, a raw, exposed part of him that ached for understanding. Was this really about the hat, a simple piece of clothing, or was it about who he was, the legacy he carried, the family name that was both a shield and a target? He crossed his arms, a silent act of defiance, stood his ground, and declared, "Then I guess I'm not leaving." The tension in the lobby thickened palpably, the air heavy with unspoken words and judgments. Staff members began to murmur among themselves, their hushed tones like the buzzing of agitated bees. And a manager, Miss Caldwell, appeared, her expression both apologetic and resolute, a carefully crafted mask of corporate composure. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice measured, each syllable precise, We'd like to avoid a scene. If you'd prefer, we can make arrangements at another hotel for you. The offer was polite, but the underlying message was clear. You're not welcome here. Barron's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped his ID and credit card. He said nothing. He simply picked up his belongings and turned on his heel. As he walked toward the doors, the hushed conversation behind him swelled, a wave of whispers and stares crashing against his back. By the time he reached the car, his phone was already buzzing, vibrating with the ferocity of a trapped bird. Someone had recorded the entire interaction. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a firestorm, a media frenzy that would engulf him and the nation. By the time Agent Miller pulled the car away from the Grand Crest Hotel, the video was already online. A bystander in the lobby, quick to recognize the young Trump, had uploaded a short clip titled, "Barron Trump denied stay over MAGA hat at luxury hotel." Within minutes, it began to spread like wildfire, igniting the dry tinderbox of social media. The internet was ablaze with debates, outrage, and ridicule. Sitting in the back seat, Barron stared at his phone, watching the flood of notifications and mentions, each one a tiny sting. The comments were a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Good for the hotel. MAGA hats don't belong in classy places. Discrimination, plain and simple. Doesn't matter who you are. He's just a kid trying to live his life. Leave him alone. Barron scrolled aimlessly, his face unreadable, a carefully constructed mask. But inside, a whirlwind of emotions churned. Anger, humiliation, a deep-seated loneliness. Part of him wanted to ignore it all, to disappear back into the anonymity he craved. But another part felt the sting of injustice, the bitter taste of being judged, not for who he was, but for what he represented. For years, he'd tried to carve out an identity separate from the shadow of his family, to be seen as just Barron. Now, it seemed impossible. This wasn't just about him. It was about the name he carried, the hat he wore, and the assumptions, the prejudices, the hatred that came with both. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, the staff was in full damage control mode. Miss Caldwell, still shaken from the encounter, gathered her team in the back office. Her face, usually impeccably composed, was etched with worry. "We need a statement, and we need it now," she said, her tone sharp, each word clipped. This could spiral out of control, but it already had. The Grand Crest social media pages were flooded with angry messages, a torrent of digital vitriol. Longtime patrons threatened boycotts, their loyalty shattered. Others praised the hotel for taking a stand, for upholding their supposed values. News outlets picked up the story, each one adding its own spin, its own bias. Was this an act of principled neutrality or blatant discrimination? The narrative depended on who was telling it, on which side of the increasingly polarized nation they stood. As the hours passed, reporters began arriving at the hotel, their cameras like predatory eyes, hungry for a story. Guests were interviewed at the entrance, their opinions as polarized as the online discourse. "I think the policy makes sense," said a man in a tailored suit, his tone smug. "Politics don't belong here." But a woman, holding her luggage, her voice tight with anger, countered, "Denying service over a hat? That's absurd. It's discrimination." Barron's phone rang. It was his mother. He hesitated before answering, his stomach clenching. "I saw the video," she said, her voice tinged with concern. A mother's worry for her son. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied flatly, though his tone betrayed his frustration, his exhaustion with the constant battles. "It's not like this is the first time something like this has happened." His mother paused, her silence heavy with unspoken understanding. "Do you want me to handle it?" "No," Barron said firmly, surprising even himself. "I'll deal with it." For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about the hotel or even the hat. It was about standing up for himself, for his right to exist without being constantly defined by the actions and beliefs of others. He hung up the phone and stared out the window as the car sped down the highway, the majestic Wyoming landscape blurring into a meaningless canvas. Back at the Grand Crest, the chaos only intensified. The video's reach had grown exponentially, and now celebrities and politicians were chiming in, their voices adding fuel to the already raging fire. Each new comment stoked the flames further, pushing the story into a full-blown media circus. As night fell, the hotel lobby was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing like strobe lights, their questions sharp and relentless. Guests complained about the disruption, their peaceful retreat shattered. The once serene Grand Crest had become a battleground of opinions and ideals, a microcosm of a nation deeply divided. And yet, amidst the frenzy, Barron's silence was deafening. He had become a symbol, a Rorschach test onto which people projected their own fears and beliefs. But as tensions rose, one question loomed. How far would this go before someone stepped in to make it right, to remind everyone that there was a human being at the center of this storm? By morning, the story had reached every corner of the internet and beyond. News anchors debated it on morning shows, their voices rising in passionate arguments. Hashtags like hashtag MAGA Hotelgate and hashtag Barron Trump trended on social media, each tweet a tiny hammer blow against the fragile peace. Opinion pieces flooded major publications. Some called it a brave stand against divisive symbols, others labeled it an outrageous act of discrimination, a violation of fundamental rights. The Grand Crest Hotel's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls, a cacophony of voices, coming in from both supporters and detractors. Barron, meanwhile, found himself holed up in a modest Airbnb on the outskirts of the town. He'd chosen the location precisely for its lack of luxury, somewhere he could lay low, a temporary refuge from the prying eyes of the world. But privacy was hard to come by when the world had you under a microscope, when your every move was dissected and analyzed. A news van parked outside the property, the crew waiting like vultures, hoping to catch a glimpse, a quote, anything to feed the insatiable hunger of the news cycle. Sitting at the kitchen table, Barron scrolled through his phone. Every major outlet had covered the story, each with its own slant, its own agenda. Headlines ranged from Barron Trump denied hotel stay in Wyoming to should politics stay out of hospitality? The weight of the situation was finally sinking in, crushing him under its immense pressure. It wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It was a cultural flashpoint, a symbol of the deep divisions tearing at the fabric of society. People were arguing about him, using his name to validate their own beliefs, their own fears. He wasn't sure what stung more, the rejection at the hotel or the way strangers felt entitled to define him, to mold him into the shape that best fit their narrative. He was a pawn in their game, and he was tired of playing. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a direct message request on Instagram. Curious, he opened it to find a message from a woman named Sarah Chun, a journalist for a well-known independent media outlet. Hi Barron, the message read, I'd like to hear your side of the story. I think people deserve to know how you're feeling about all this. Let me know if you're interested in talking. Barron stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd avoided speaking publicly about the incident so far, not wanting to add fuel to the fire, not wanting to give the media more ammunition. But Sarah Chin's tone felt different, less accusatory, more curious, more human. For a brief moment, he considered responding, imagining the relief of finally being able to tell his side of the story. But then he thought better of it, the fear of further scrutiny, of being misunderstood, holding him back. Instead, he closed the app and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the world pressing down on him. At the Grand Crest, things were reaching a boiling point. The hotel's management team huddled in a conference room, their faces drawn and pale, exhausted from the relentless backlash. Their carefully worded statement, emphasizing their commitment to neutrality and guest comfort, had backfired spectacularly, with critics calling it a non-apology, a cowardly attempt to appease both sides. Should we just let him come back? One staff member asked, exasperated, his voice hoarse from answering angry phone calls. And what happens when other guests complain? Countered another. We'll look weak. The policy is the policy. But this isn't just about policy anymore, Ms. Caldwell said, rubbing her temples, her head throbbing with a tension headache. This is about the hotel's reputation. If we don't handle this correctly, we're finished. The carefully cultivated image of the Grand Crest, the image of serene luxury and impeccable service, was crumbling before her eyes. Outside, Protesters had begun gathering. Some waved signs supporting Barron, demanding justice, their chants echoing through the crisp mountain air. "Let him stay! Let him stay!" Others applauded the hotel's decision, arguing that political symbols of any kind had no place in a neutral setting, their signs proclaiming, "No politics in paradise." The divide was palpable, a physical manifestation of the online. Tempers were running high, fueled by frustration and a sense of righteous indignation. Barron watched live footage of the protests on his phone, his expression unreadable, a mask he'd perfected over a lifetime in the public eye. He couldn't help but wonder how a simple weekend getaway had turned into this spectacle, this national drama. Deep down, though, he knew it wasn't about the hat. It was about what it represented, both to him and to everyone else. It was about the unhealed wounds of a nation divided. And yet, amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. An older man in a well-worn leather jacket approached the protesters on both sides, speaking calmly and quietly, though he was hard to hear over the noise. His presence was striking, his demeanor composed, almost serene. People began to listen, drawn in by his quiet authority. Barron had no idea who the man was, but he felt an inexplicable sense, a gut feeling, that this stranger might be the key to unraveling the mess, to bridging the seemingly insurmountable divide. As the protests intensified, the mysterious figure at the center of the crowd began to shift the tone, his words cutting through the noise like a beacon of reason. But no one was prepared for what he would say next, for the challenge he would issue. Barron sat by the window of his Airbnb, watching the news coverage of the protests outside the Grand Crest Hotel. The crowd had doubled in size since morning, and the camera occasionally panned to the older man in the leather jacket, who appeared to be mediating between the opposing sides. His voice was soft yet commanding, his gestures deliberate, calming. Barron leaned forward, intrigued, drawn in by the man's quiet charisma. For the first time in days, Barron allowed himself a moment to think, not about the headlines, the protests, or the relentless opinions being hurled in his direction, but about himself. His life had always been under scrutiny, a constant performance for an audience he never chose. He was shaped by expectations he didn't choose and a legacy he didn't ask for. The hat, something he wore more out of habit than conviction, had become a lightning rod, not just for others, but for him, too. It forced him to confront his own identity. He thought about what the hat meant to him. Growing up, it had been a symbol of family pride, a way to stand by his father even when the world seemed determined to tear him down. But as he got older, he began to question what it represented to others. Was it a declaration of loyalty, a statement of defiance, or something more divisive, more hurtful than he had ever intended? A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Agent Miller poked his head in, his usually stoic face showing a hint of curiosity. "There's someone here to see you," he said. "Says his name is Elijah Walker, but everyone calls him Eli. He's the guy everyone's talking about at the protests." Barron hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to meet anyone right now, let alone someone tied to the chaos outside. But curiosity, and perhaps a deeper, unacknowledged longing for connection, won out. "Let him in," he said. Eli Walker entered, his presence as unassuming as it was commanding. Up close, Barron could see the weathered lines on his face, the kind that came from years of experience, from a life lived fully, not sheltered. He carried a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need to be announced, that simply was. "I figured you'd be watching," Eli said, gesturing toward the muted TV, where the protest outside the hotel continued to unfold. "Thought I'd come by and save you the trouble of wondering." Barron raised an eyebrow, intrigued by this man who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. "And you are?" Barron asked, his tone neutral, guarded, yet tinged with curiosity. "Just someone who's seen enough to know when things are spiraling out of control," Eli replied, his gaze steady, meeting Barron's. He took a seat across from him, uninvited but not unwelcome. There was an air of calm about him, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. "You probably think this is all about a hat, but it's not, is it?" Barron didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he knew the answer himself, not fully. The hat had become so much more than just a hat. It was a symbol, a statement, a burden. People out there are angry, Eli continued, his voice soft but firm, cutting through the noise from the TV. Some because they think you're standing for something they hate, others because they think you're being treated unfairly. But neither side is really listening to each other. Or to you. Barron leaned back, folding his arms, a defensive posture he'd adopted countless times. What do you want me to do? Go out there and give a speech? That'll just make it worse. He could already imagine the headlines, the mockery, the endless analysis, the twisting of his words. Eli shook his head, a gentle smile playing on his lips. And no speeches, and no grandstanding. Just honesty. Tell them what you told yourself when you put that hat on today. Because right now, they're not fighting over you. They're fighting over what they think you represent. Barron frowned, mulling over Eli's words. He wasn't used to people speaking to him so plainly, without deference or judgment, without trying to use him for their own agenda. It was refreshing and unsettling, like a cool breeze on a hot day. I'm not even sure what I represent anymore, he admitted quietly, the words escaping from his lips before he could stop them, to myself or anyone else. It was a truth he hadn't dared to voice, even to himself, until now. A truth that had been buried under layers of expectation and public scrutiny. Eli nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer, as if he understood the weight of those words. Then maybe it's time to figure that out. Not for them, he emphasized, pointing towards the TV, for you. Barron sat in silence, absorbing Eli's words. They resonated deep within him, stirring something he thought he'd buried long ago. The desire to define himself on his own terms, to break free from the mold others had created for him. Eli stood to leave, his movements quiet and deliberate. I'll be outside if you decide to take that first step, he said, his tone gentle but firm, leaving the weight of the decision squarely on Barron's shoulders. And with that, he was gone, leaving Barron alone with his thoughts, his doubts, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A fragile hope, perhaps, but hope nonetheless. Barron stared at the closed door, his mind racing, a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. For the first time in a long while, he felt the faint stirrings of clarity, a sense of purpose that had been buried under the weight of expectation and public scrutiny. Maybe this wasn't about the hat, or even the hotel. Maybe it was about taking control of his own narrative, about finally defining who he was, rather than letting others define him. As the noise outside grew louder, the chants and shouts from the protesters reaching a fever pitch, Barron faced a choice. Retreat into the shadows, into the comfortable anonymity he'd sought, or step into the light, into the heart of the storm, and make his voice heard. The world was waiting, holding its breath, for his next move. The crowd outside the Grand Crest Hotel had swelled to a breaking point. Protesters on both sides of the debate, now more entrenched than ever, were separated by a thin line of police officers, their faces grim, their presence a stark reminder of the potential for violence. Their voices grew louder, more strident with every passing minute, fueled by a potent cocktail of anger, frustration, and self-righteousness. Barron watched from a distance, safe within the confines of his borrowed car, Agent Miller a silent presence beside him. As Eli stepped between the groups, his hands raised, signaling for calm. The cameras, ever present, zoomed in on him, the older man who had somehow managed to capture everyone's attention, a lone figure amidst the chaos. His voice, though steady, carried enough authority to silence the crowd momentarily, a testament to his commanding presence. "Listen up," Eli began, his tone measured but firm, his voice cutting through the noise. "You're all here because of a disagreement about a hat, right? But let's get real. This isn't just about a piece of fabric. It's about what it represents to each of you. And that's where the problem starts." Barron leaned closer to the screen, his curiosity piqued, his heart pounding in his chest. Eli's words weren't rehearsed or overly polished. They felt raw, authentic, as if he were speaking from experience, from a deep well of understanding. "You're shouting at each other like you're enemies," Eli continued, his voice echoing across the now silent crowd. "But has anyone actually tried to listen? To ask why that hat makes some of you proud and others angry? Because until you do, all you're doing is adding fuel to a fire that helps no one. The crowd murmured, their collective energy shifting, the anger and hostility beginning to dissipate. Some lowered their signs. Others exchanged hesitant glances, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. Eli took a deep breath and scanned the faces before him, his gaze lingering on each individual, as if seeing through their masks of anger and into their hearts. "I'm not here to take sides," he said, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. "I'm not here to tell you what to think or how to feel. I'm here to remind you that there's a person at the center of all this. A young man who didn't ask for this circus, who didn't ask to become a symbol of your divisions. Maybe instead of fighting about what he represents, you should let him tell you himself." The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The protesters were no longer shouting, but the weight of their unspoken words, their deeply held beliefs, hung heavy in the silence. Eli turned to the cameras, his gaze direct and unflinching, challenging, almost daring. "Barron Trump, if you're watching this, the floor is yours," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We're ready to listen." Barron's breath hitched. The invitation was unexpected, a bolt from the blue, and the pressure felt immense, crushing. He glanced at Agent Miller, his security detail, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, a silent message of support. "Think you're ready for this?" Agent Miller asked, his voice low, his eyes searching Barron's. Barron hesitated, his mind racing, a torrent of doubts and fears swirling within him. For years, he'd avoided the spotlight, letting others speak for him, letting others define him. But now, he had a chance to reclaim his voice, to set the record straight, not just for the world, but for himself. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "but I think it's time I tried." It was a declaration, a promise to himself. Agent Miller handed him a jacket, a simple, nondescript garment, and Barron slid it on, his movements slow and deliberate, each action imbued with a newfound sense of purpose. As he stepped outside, the cool air hit his face, grounding him in the moment, anchoring him to the present. The reporters, the protesters, and the police all turned toward him, their eyes wide with anticipation, a sea of faces, a multitude of expectations. Eli met him halfway, his expression calm and reassuring, a silent pillar of support. "Take your time," he whispered, his hand briefly touching Barron's arm. "Speak from the heart. Just be you." Barron swallowed hard, his throat dry, and approached the crowd. The cameras zoomed in, their lenses like hungry eyes, the microphones angled toward him, eager to capture every word. And the noise fell to a deafening silence, a silence so profound it roared in his ears. With the world watching, holding its breath, Barron prepared to deliver the words that would define this moment, that would, perhaps, begin to define him. Not for others, but for himself. He was stepping out of the shadows, into the light, ready to face the storm. Barron stood in the spotlight, the weight of countless eyes on him. The crowd, once divided and restless, now waited in an almost eerie silence. The only sound was the occasional rustle of protest signs and the faint hum of distant traffic. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, drawing strength from somewhere deep within. For years, the world had spoken about him as if he were a symbol, a placeholder for larger debates. But standing there, he felt something shift. He wasn't just a name or an image anymore. He was a person, with his own story to tell, his own truth to share. "I didn't plan for any of this," Barron began, his voice steady but soft, projecting across the silent expanse. "When I booked a room at the Grand Crest, I just wanted a quiet weekend. I didn't think my hat would be an issue. But I guess it was never really about the hat, was it?" He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical, but all were listening, their attention riveted on him. "For some of you, this hat represents something you believe in, something you're proud of. For others, it's a reminder of things you've experienced, or things you're afraid of. And honestly, I get it. Symbols have power. They mean different things to different people. The crowd murmured in agreement, a mix of nods and folded arms, a sea of faces reflecting a myriad of emotions. Barron continued, his tone growing firmer, his voice resonating with newfound confidence. But here's the thing. I didn't put this hat on to make a statement today. I put it on because it's part of who I am, part of my history. That doesn't mean I agree with everything it stands for to everyone else. It just means it's a piece of my life. And I shouldn't have to explain that every time I walk into a room. The tension in the air began to thaw, replaced by a sense of curiosity, a willingness to listen. People leaned in, eager to hear more, their preconceived notions momentarily suspended. What happened at the hotel wasn't just about me, Barron said, his voice ringing with sincerity. It was about how we see each other, how quick we are to judge someone based on a single thing. A hat, a name, a background. But we're all more than that, aren't we? The protesters on both sides exchanged glances, some nodding slowly, a flicker of understanding in their eyes. Eli, standing off to the side, gave Barron a subtle look of approval, a silent acknowledgement of the courage it took to stand there and speak his truth. "I'm not here to change your minds about anything," Barron said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, connecting with individuals. "I'm here to ask you to think about the person standing in front of you, not just the symbol you think they represent. Because if we can't do that, then what are we even doing?" A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first, but growing louder, spreading through the crowd like a wave. Barron glanced at the reporters, their cameras trained on him, capturing every word, every nuance. "I'll leave you with this," he said, his voice steady, filled with a quiet strength. "We don't have to agree on everything to respect each other. But if we keep letting symbols divide us, we're going to lose sight of what really matters, the people behind them." With that, Barron stepped back, letting the applause wash over him, a wave of sound that seemed to cleanse the air. Eli approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, kid," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine admiration. The crowd began to disperse, the tension that had hung so heavy in the air replaced by a hum of thoughtful conversation. Protesters lowered their signs, some even engaging in discussions with those they'd stood against moments before. The media captured the transformation, their headlines now shifting focus. Barron Trump's speech sparks unlikely dialogue at protest. As Barron walked away from the scene, he felt lighter, freer, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He hadn't solved all the world's problems, but he'd taken a step toward understanding his own place in it. And maybe, just maybe, he'd helped others do the same. But the real victory wasn't in the speech. It was in the quiet moments that followed, as strangers began to see each other not as enemies, but as people. As Barron stepped into the car, driven by Agent Miller, waiting to take him back to his Airbnb, he caught a final glimpse of the crowd. What had started as a clash of opinions had softened into something far more meaningful: conversations. Protesters who had shouted past one another were now talking, sharing their perspectives. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in a world desperately in need of understanding. Sitting in the back seat, Barron reflected on what had just happened. The experience had pushed him out of his comfort zone, forcing him to confront the complexities of identity, perception, and communication. The hat had been a catalyst, but the real story wasn't about the symbol. It was about the people, their stories, and their willingness to listen. As the car pulled away, Eli's words echoed in his mind. "It's not about changing minds. It's about opening hearts." For everyone involved, Barron, the protesters, the hotel staff, this was a moment of growth, a reminder that behind every headline, there's a human story worth hearing. Perhaps the world needed less judgment and more understanding, less division and more connection. And as for Barron, he finally felt like he was beginning to define himself, not by the expectations of others, but by his own voice, his own choices. The journey wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could navigate the complexities of his life with a newfound clarity and purpose. He was more than just a name, more than just a hat, more than just a symbol. He was Barron Trump, and he was finally finding his voice. The voice of a young man stepping out from the shadows, ready to face the world on his own terms, a voice that, against all odds, had managed to cut through the noise and remind everyone of our shared humanity.